Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. Whether you live in Hawaii, visit Hawaii, or have never been here before, you know that the reputation we have as a destination for business and for capital investment is quickly declining. Whether you've heard stories about the demise of the super ferry or the recent demise of the 30-meter telescope project, it looks like Hawaii's not the safest place to invest, nor the best place to do business. Now, sometimes this is all based upon stories, and once in a while we have consumer business magazines coming out with low rankings for the state of Hawaii. How reliable are they? Well, there's good news. At the Grassroots Institute, we have a friend organization, the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that does tremendous work in quantifying exactly where the 50 states are in terms of economic performance. In fact, they do the best job around. They take all 50 states and rank them according to 15 key variables. Today, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you their 9th edition. This is a project that has been going on for nearly a decade, and we'll have with us Jonathan Williams. He's the Vice President for State Fiscal Reform, the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. I think you're going to find this quite fascinating as we look at actual measurements as to how our performance is doing as a state and how we compare with other states. Let me welcome to the program now from Arlington, Virginia, Jonathan Williams. Jonathan, aloha, welcome to Hawaii, at least by Skype.
Well, thank you, and aloha back, and greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., here in the Northern Virginia offices of ALEC.
Well, there you are. But you play a very interesting role. You get to get out of Washington from time to time because you actually take a look at the economic performances of all of the 50 states. How long has this project been going on?
That's right. So the Rich States, Poor States project that I started actually when I came to ALEC 9 years ago means that we go out to all of 50 states, or as we like to call them, laboratories of democracy, and talk about what kind of policies are working and what kind of policies are not working. It's really a fascinating look because the states are just so different from each other to see what works and what doesn't across the 50 states.
Well, you know, your work is so very important to us. As a state policy think tank here in Hawaii, we rely on data when we go to the state legislature, when we educate policymakers and the public, and when we design policies to propose to our state leaders. We're always looking at what other states do. And I have to tell you, I find no better source than your annual report, Rich States, Poor States. How did you come up with the various measures that you look at in order to compare states' economic performance?
Well, thank you for that compliment. We really do work hard here to provide a really non-biased, good source of information for serious policymakers, business owners, and taxpayers alike as to how their state ranks versus the other 49. And what we put together, the 15 equally weighted factors that we use in Rich States, Poor States, we wanted to focus really on two things because obviously, as you know, thousands of things matter for economic growth across states. But we focus on the two factors. First of all, things that state policymakers actually can control. It's within their power to change. Obviously, many things are without their, they don't have the power to change. Secondly, there are things that we know matter for economic growth. Based on the academic evidence over the last few decades, we chose factors that matter for business relocation, matter for income growth, matter for job growth, and matter for overall economic growth for the states.
You know, unfortunately, for those of us in Hawaii, we slid down a bit in the annual rankings. In fact, we dropped quite a bit, about 5 or 6 spaces. So unfortunately, we are ranked at number 42 on the chart in terms of economic competitiveness or economic outlook. How did we get such a low ranking, Jonathan?
Well, there's kind of a nuanced answer there in that, first of all, you deserve some credit for allowing the previous income tax increases to go back down. And I think that's very good news for the hardworking people of Hawaii. The bad news came in the form of minimum wage increases, which was one of the big drivers of your downfall in economic outlook. And as you noted, you fell a full 5 spots in economic outlook in our rankings, and then rejoined the bottom 10, which are a group of states you really don't want to be a part of, and that's the California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, a group of states that have had so many financial problems with business development.
Well, that's right. In fact, you've got a contrasting set of states at the very top. Utah, I see, is number one, North Carolina, number two, followed by North Dakota, Wyoming, Arizona, Indiana. What makes these states so high ranking in terms of economic outlook?
The general philosophy of those states like Utah and North Carolina that you talk about are states that keep taxes at a reasonable level, that make sure that government doesn't grow beyond its means, not faster than the private sector that obviously supports the overall growth of government. There are also states that have looked at things like pension reform, looked at things like spending control. But generally, there are states that keep a philosophy that's open for business, that wants to be as friendly to business as possible, and keeping government out of the way as much as possible. I think those are really the things that separate out those rich states in our index from the others.
I noticed that in the list of variables, the very first has to do with income tax, personal income tax. You call it the top marginal personal income tax rate. Now, that's something that is set by policymakers. Hawaii has a ranking of 43rd in the nation. Tell me a little bit about that.
And that's right. The personal income tax variable, I think, is one of the most important for economic growth across the states. And this is not just us that believe that. This is people like the OECD researchers who follow developed world economies also say that taxes on income are some of the most damaging for growth. This is something that so many people forget about because you hear this rhetoric from people like Bernie Sanders to say you need to raise the taxes on the millionaires and billionaires out there to make sure they quote unquote pay their fair share. Here's the thing that most Americans don't realize about that. A huge percentage of small businesses who employ, in many cases, a large majority of private sector workers across states pay their taxes on the individual side of the code. So when you talk about the importance of a personal income tax to keep that rate low, these are taxes paid by small business owners who, after all, as you know, are the big job creators out there today in terms of overall job growth.
You know, Hawaii has such a high amount of personal income tax that it's hard to justify, yet people do. We frequently hear that's necessary because government must spend that money in order to provide services. And without the collection of those taxes, we won't have the kinds of health and education and welfare services that are so essential to society. So in a sense, that's necessary for the functioning of a healthy society. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it couldn't be more wrong. It really couldn't. You look at, for instance, the 9 states across the country that do not tax personal income whatsoever. They're some of the biggest growth states for economic competitiveness, such as Texas and Florida. Even states more on the liberal side of the spectrum, like Washington State, have long enjoyed not having a personal income tax. And it's been a huge benefit to those states because one of the things that many people don't realize about the personal income tax is also they're some of the most volatile sources of revenue. Mm-hmm. So the boom and bust cycle, when we go through the business cycle, what are the things to first fall are corporate income and personal income. And those are things when states rely on them too heavily for revenue, they run into some major problems when it comes to volatility as well.
Well, if we don't tax people heavily through personal income tax, how then can the government generate revenues?
Well, here's one that's probably a shocker to those that may not follow New England policy is New Hampshire. As we like to say, the live free or die state is the motto of New Hampshire. It's a state without a personal income tax or a sales tax. Believe that, right? I mean, that's really a shocker to a lot of people, yet they fund all of those core functions of government, like roads and hospitals and education and all the things that taxpayers desire. And how do they do it? They do it by properly prioritizing government and deciding between needs and wants, making sure that government revenues go to those most important functions of government. That's really the key. And to quote the famous Jack Kemp, he would always say the key to raising significant long-term revenue is not by raising tax rates, but by increasing the amount of taxpayers that are paying into the system. And that's the key to the states that don't have a personal income tax, is they continue to attract Americans from the other 49 states. And they say, as we say, vote with their feet towards those states with lower taxes.
Well, certainly, as you point out, having correct priorities would lead to a more efficient use of funding, making funding go further so the government would need less. But in terms of economic activity and so forth, have you been able to see that by leaving money in the economy so that consumers can spend it and businesses can reinvest it, instead of taxing it out of the economy, that it ultimately produces more revenue so that downstream government revenues rise as well?
That's exactly the case. We do this comparison of those 9 states, as I mentioned, that do not tax personal income on wages, and we compare them versus the 9 states that tax income the most. Hawaii, of course, was one of those states up until recently. Of course, that's California, New York, Illinois, Maryland, and some others. And you look at the comparisons on overall economic growth, whether you're looking at gross state product, which is a broad measure, as you know, of growth, or income growth, which is wage growth, and things like that. Even revenue growth is much stronger because of this feedback, almost the Laffer curve effect, that when you have a more competitive state economy, you will find more economic activity. It gets back to economics 101. When you tax something less, you get more of it. When you tax something more, you get less of it. It's the basic theory of incentives, and it's really playing out across the 50 states.
Well, that's a fascinating way of looking at the economy, one which may not exist amongst many policymakers, certainly here in the state of Hawaii. When we come back from a break, Jonathan, I'd like to ask you to explain that just a little more, and we'll take a look at some of the other variables. My guest today is Jonathan Williams, Vice President for Fiscal and State Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. He's going to share with us a bit more about how we can actually measure our economic performance as a state and what our government can do. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
Aloha. This is Reg Baker. I'm the host of Business in Hawaii. We air every Thursday at 2 o'clock on thinktechhawaii.com. We broadcast from the ThinkTech studios in downtown Honolulu, and we talk about positive and successful companies in Hawaii. People that have been successful despite the obstacles. They all have a good story to tell. Hopefully we'll see you on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Aloha.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I hope that you will tune in and watch the show. It is inspiring and uplifting and educational also. We talk with artists of all different ilk. We talk with them about what they do, how they do it, and most importantly, most dear to my heart, why they do it. And it never ceases to be fascinating when you get the answer to that question. I hope you'll join us on Center Stage, 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoons. Aloha.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host a show, Climate Change Beyond Outrage. In it, we go beyond outrage to look at solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. Join me every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Hawaii Standard Time. See you then.
Welcome back to the second segment of today's Ehana Kako show on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Ehana Kako, it may sound familiar to many of you like a pule kako, which means let's pray together. At the Grassroots Institute, we also say Ehana Kako, let's work together. Let's work together for a better government, economy, and society, because think of the terrible alternative of not working together. Things come to a standstill. Well, you know, one of the things that I do like very much about this report, Rich State, Poor State, from the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALEC, is that it's nonpartisan. It represents working together. In fact, I'm going to go back to my guest today, Vice President for the Center for Fiscal State Reform, and a co-author of the Rich States, Poor States document that comes out every year, and to ask him a little bit about that working together. Jonathan, is ALEC an organization that is sponsored largely by one political party or one political ideology, or is it truly an across-the-board organization?
Well, let me just say is we are truly inclusive. We will take Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians, vegetarians, anybody who wants to talk about state solutions and collaborating together to find really the best practices for state policy. Now, we don't make any bones about it. We fully believe in the power of free markets and limited government and federalism. Those are our guiding principles. But we welcome all to the table. We hope that ALEC is this table for really nonpartisan discourse of what leads to more success across states and hopefully avoiding those things that cause states problems.
The annual Rich States, Poor States is also somewhat of a guide to best practices used by many legislators and persons in Congress and the Senate. Do you have some kind of organizational membership or sponsorship or endorsement by any of the Congress persons?
Well, we have roughly 100 members of the current United States Congress who are ALEC alumni members from when they served in their state legislative bodies. And also nearly 10 U.S. governors currently were ALEC members when they were in their legislative bodies. And these include Democrats and Republicans alike. And so we invite all to be ALEC members. It's only $50 a year for a state legislator to become a member of ALEC, and we certainly encourage that. We don't take taxpayer funding like some of the other legislative organizations do, and so we rely on the support of people who are concerned about these issues to keep ALEC afloat. And we've been around for more than 40 years now with those missions to really pursue free markets and limited government and federalism in this bipartisan fashion.
In that approach, it's very similar to the Grassroots Institute here in our local policy world in Hawaii. Now, let me get back to a point that we made, or you made at the end of the first segment, and that is that there's a different economic model that is being used by the variables that you've identified in ALEC. Instead of thinking that government needs to grow and tax people more in order to get revenues, you're thinking government can actually tax less, leaving more money in the economy, allowing consumers to spend more, allowing businesses to invest more, thus generating more revenue for the government in the long run. What's the evidential base for this?
Well, you just need to look at the real world. I mean, that's really all far you need to go on this, is that this gets down to not just the economics classroom of Economics 101, as we were talking about in the theory of incentives, but we need to look at and answer the question, who is it that creates wealth in the economy? You know, some would say, based on the kind of tax and spend model, that it's government that creates wealth. But I would posit that based on our theory of economics, as well as the practice of economics across the 50 states for many years now, it's obviously the private sector that really does create wealth. And government only exists when it has the resources from that productive private sector to exist. And I think that's really where the two theories of government, the two models that we talk about so often in rich states, poor states, where those philosophies differ, is that you will have some that believe that the only way to create wealth is by government taking more out of the private sector economy and taxing more and spending more through stimulus programs and many other things, where I think the evidence is very strong to suggest that it's the exact opposite, that government can't even function without the support of a vibrant private sector. Look at those areas across the country that their government is crumbling, that their roads are quite often literally crumbling because they don't have money to pay for it. It's because they've lost their tax base, they've lost businesses, they've lost the entrepreneurs and the innovators that are the drivers of the economy. And when that happens, the logical result is there's no money left over to pay for government, and then the government goes back and expects even more from the existing residents that are left behind. And unfortunately, being a native of Michigan, we realized many, many problems in our years, of course, the loss of the automobile industry and others, where we've seen so many towns like Detroit and Flint and Saginaw go near bankruptcy, if not fully into bankruptcy, and of course have realized the consequences of many, many bad years of policy.
You know, there's another dampener on our economy that you identify in a second variable in which we happen to be ranked 50th, dead last in the nation, and that's the impact of our general excise tax policies. We kind of have a hybrid sales tax and general excise tax rolled up into one. We call it the GET. From your vantage point, what do you see about our GET?
Well, just overall, it's an incredibly high burden on the hardworking taxpayers of Hawaii, in that no other state in the nation, and this is awfully important, no other state gains more revenue out of that tax than Hawaii does. And obviously that might be a boon for government, but it's very bad news for hardworking taxpayers that are looking to make ends meet and balance their own budgets and take care of their families and try to save something for their kids to go to school or maybe to go back to school themselves. This is a huge burden. It's the cost of government. And you add that to the very high income tax or the personal income tax that we just talked about. And it's really a dangerous cocktail of tax policy that is taking way too much off of the backs of the hardworking people of Hawaii.
Very few people realize here in the state of Hawaii that the GET is responsible for close to 50% of the entire state general fund. And that's a huge, huge amount, making it a real sacred cow. The other thing about it is it is pervasive, isn't it? It's what we call a consumption tax. Jonathan, what's the danger of consumption taxes that are on every single transaction that's consumed?
Well, this is the big danger of this, as you know, is the lack of transparency. And that we talk about the principles of sound tax policy in rich states, poor states. And one of the very key principles is that every single taxpayer, every single individual across every state should deserve to know what kind of government taxes are being taken out of their paycheck, out of their consumption when they spend money, or when they own property from their property. As a burden of government. And many times these taxes, such as the GET tax there in Hawaii, are a very non-transparent way, because many times when people go and buy things, they have no idea what the total tax bill is as a part of that product, because it's a hidden cost, and that's the epitome of bad tax policy. We want taxpayers to know exactly what the cost of government is, so then they can make those rational decisions themselves. Should government economize more? Should it spend more? Should it spend less? But unless people have the information necessary to make those economic, rational decisions, that's almost impossible.
Now, one of the disadvantages we are aware of with our GET is that when it comes to businesses, small businesses suffer a lot because they need to be involved in multiple transactions of buying items, manufacturing them, selling them to vendors, and then the vendors sell them and so forth. So we're taxed at every single level, as opposed to big corporations that may have all of those processes in-house. But how does this GET also hurt the poor or those at the lowest levels of income?
Well, relative to other forms of taxes, it's a very regressive tax. It takes a larger share of the tax burden away from those who are least able to afford it. And that certainly should be at least one consideration when looking at the tax system. But also, I wanted to just piggyback on the point that you just made about small businesses. As many times as they're not as vertically integrated as the larger businesses and are not able to take advantage of that kind of part of the tax system, they're penalized relative to big business when it comes to the GET tax. And that's so often the case when it comes to tax policy, is we find that small businesses come out at a disadvantage because so many times when discussions of tax policy are made, they're not the ones with the high-priced lobbyists down at the Capitol to make those decisions. And so keeping in mind small business whenever talking about tax policy is a very, very good thing.
We like to use the phrase here in Hawaii called the price of paradise. It's almost a way we justify everything, because at least we've got the beautiful sunsets, the lovely weather, the warm breezes. But it really is a high price to live here. But as your report points out, it's also a high price to die here. I was stunned when I saw that we're ranked number 50, the most expensive state in the nation in which to die, according to your study of our property and inheritance taxes. Want to talk about that a bit?
Well, it's so much of a counterproductive tax, the tax on estates or inheritances that we talk about across the states. And so many states over the last 5 to 10 years have gone about to repeal their state level death taxes because, as you know, there's been many discussions here in Congress to change the way that it works at the federal level. But states just have realized that it's a huge economic downturn, because what it does is it forces many small businesses and family farms and ranches in other states as well to liquidate, because the only way they can pay the government tax when an individual unfortunately dies is by liquidating their assets to pay the bill. And unfortunately, that means that many times those small businesses cannot be passed from generation to generation. And that's why Americans view this as an immoral tax. You look at public polling when it comes to tax policy, and generally some of the most hated taxes are gas taxes, property taxes, and then the death tax. And the death tax is a tax that a vast majority of Americans will never pay because of the wealth that's needed to be accumulated to have to pay the tax. However, they know that it's a second or third tax on the same income that people have earned throughout their lifetime, and they just don't think it's fair or it's right that one family needs to pay that tax and liquidate and lose the family business just for the privilege of paying that tax to the government.
Well, let's shift our focus a bit. We also have some categories in which Hawaii is not ranked very low. In fact, we happen to have some of the most attractive property taxes in the country, as well as corporate taxes. When we come back from a short break, I'll ask you how to interpret that and what that really means for Hawaii's economic health. Again, we're talking with Jonathan Williams, Vice President for the Center for Fiscal State Reform, or State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. He'll give us a little more insight into how Hawaii's performance is doing, even in areas where we don't look like we're doing that poorly. We'll be right back after this quick break.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, citizen journalism from Hawaii, finding the intersection of our sense of place and our place in the world, right here at home. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
Hello, I'm Stephen Katz, and I'm the host of Shrink Wrap, which comes to you live every Tuesday at 3 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com, and then it's repeated again whenever you want if you go to the website. On our show, we will be talking to all different kinds of therapists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, people who talk about the mind, the brain, and about different ways to find happiness. I myself am a marriage and family therapist in practice here in Hawaii, and I hope you will join us because I've got a lot to learn, you've got a lot to learn, and it's a great ride. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Welcome back to our closing segment today of Ehana Kako, here every week on Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Mondays, broadcasting in Hawaii time at 2 o'clock. But I want to take my hat off to all of the wonderful staff and the team led by Jay Fidel at Think Tech Hawaii. They're producing about 35 hours of content original from Honolulu, going across the world through the internet, and also put onto podcasts and broadcast on Oceanic Cablevision. So whenever you want to see any of this content on a wide variety of topics ranging from science, business, the arts, to tourism and other interesting things like politics, go to www.thinktechhawaii.com. We're back to talk again with Jonathan Williams, a Vice President for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at ALEC and a co-author of Rich States, Poor States. Jonathan, it's easy for us to focus on some of the rankings that give us a very bad black eye, like personal income tax and general excise tax. But there are some rankings where we don't do that poorly. Hawaii is ranked as number 19th in terms of the top marginal corporate income tax rate. Or we're ranked number 9 in terms of property taxes. And some people actually find that to be a very attractive reason to come to Hawaii and locate their corporations. Now, should we be rejoicing about this level of taxation in these categories?
Well, certainly in these categories, it is room for some good news. We've talked a lot about bad things that have gone on in Hawaii when it comes to the policy environment. So there is some concern that you should enjoy some of these other categories that you rank relatively well. That being said, before dwelling too much on these success areas, looking at the preponderance, though, of the overall economic climate, and when you consider the GET being the highest burden sales tax category in the country, you look at the personal income tax, even after the slight reduction in just this last year, and you consider it all in one package, that's when you, I think, get to the concerning level to say, well, property taxes might not be the worst in Hawaii, while corporate income taxes are not the worst. Overall, it is a very concerning picture for economic competitiveness when you put everything together.
Some argue that the low property taxes and corporate taxes make Hawaii very attractive to outside competitors coming in here, which certainly does have some impact on stimulating our economy, but puts an unfair burden upon the small businesses that are operated by locals. Any thoughts about that?
Any state that relies too heavily on personal income taxes, as you do, and having a very progressive personal income tax that is relying on the folks that file at the higher income levels, which oftentimes are those small businesses that we've been talking about, run the risk of having that environment that will impede future economic growth when it comes to small businesses. And so all governments need to raise revenue from somewhere, right? And so the old question is how do you reposition the different legs of the stool and able to raise the core functions of government and fund those core functions through proper revenue and not burdening any one area of the economy too much. And I think the one that you especially want to watch is that small business sector, and watch that personal income tax. While all taxes matter for economic growth, taxes on capital, taxes on things like personal income and business income are some of the very most damaging for economic growth. And so I think that's probably one to keep an eye on for an area of improvement. If you want to see some results in turning things around and seeing better economic growth on the islands, look at things like that personal income tax rate.
One of the factors the report states for giving us a low economic outlook rating of 42 has been the increase in Hawaii minimum wage. And that's been something that's been implemented through different stages over the last few years, and it will go up also in the next couple of years. How does that affect our overall economy?
And the minimum wage is always one of those classic topics of discussion for economists, right? In that the political science people always think, well, it's great politics to raise the minimum wage. And us economists think it's very bad economics, right? It's one of these issues that you have this huge disconnect between the politics and the economics, and that if it were in government's position to be able to control wages just by government fiat, then why not create $100 an hour minimum wage and everyone would have relative prosperity, right? It's not that simple. And the second and third order effects are things like lower job opportunities, lost job opportunities altogether, especially for lower skilled workers, and higher unemployment rates. So there are lots of unintended consequences. That's always the thing that many policymakers forget, is that while they may be very well-intentioned policies to try to lift people out of poverty, what are the unintended consequences? And in long term, how are the ways that government structures policy, how can we really lift people out of poverty for the long term? And I think based on our research, that comes from growing more economic opportunity, creating an environment that invites more job creators to come to the Hawaiian Islands to create jobs. It's not going to be done through just government signing a bill to say you're going to pay people more, because it's not in the government's power to increase living standards. That's clearly a market function.
Minimum wage, California comes to mind now with the, or actually New York with the announcement of the $15 minimum wage. And so I want to ask you this question before we leave today, and I have another question after that, but are there some states that serve as examples of what not to do, of what Hawaii should stay away from as much as we possibly can? Can you give us some examples?
Well, sure. The bottom five in economic outlook in rich states, poor states are all very good examples of what not to do. And you mentioned New York and California, both states that are going to a $15 an hour minimum wage, and talking to small businesses as to what that will do. In fact, many cases it will put small businesses out of business. Looking at other states like New Jersey at 48, Vermont at 49, Bernie Sanders, Vermont, Connecticut at 47. Let's not forget, Connecticut just lost General Electric, a company that had been headquartered there and had just picked up and moved to Massachusetts for, among other things, lower taxes and better business climate. And New Jersey at the bottom at 48 just lost their wealthiest individual just a couple of weeks ago, hedge fund billionaire David Tepper, worth over $10 billion in assets, who moved to no-tax Florida. And already New Jersey officials are worrying about the revenue implications. And so I think that that's really one of the underlying messages of rich states, poor states, is just how much taxes matter for economic growth, how much Americans, individuals and businesses are voting with their feet, voting with their pocketbooks, and going towards states like Texas and Florida that are more entrepreneur friendly, that want to create an environment for economic opportunity. And they're generally fleeing states like California and New York. So if you were to avoid being like a state, be less like California and New York and be more like Texas and Florida.
Well, you mentioned that many of these policies are driven not by economic realities, but by politics. And so in Hawaii, it's no secret that we have a fairly one-party dominant state. Of that one party, the Democrat Party, who are diverging from the traditional frame of reference when it comes to economy. And we like to think that circulating the data from your report is one of the things that helps. We make it available to all of our state policymakers, and there are both Republicans and Democrats who actually use it. Now let me ask you another question. Where can we learn some lessons? Where should our governor and our policymakers be looking, and what kinds of lessons should they be learning from some states that are ranked very well?
Well, here's one lesson that I think is so important when it comes to taxing and spending decisions that happen. It's a bipartisan lesson, so it's very good. And that is in Washington State, one of those 9 states without a personal income tax that I talked about, which, by the way, the bond rating agency said that it's a very good thing to do it without a personal income tax because it takes away the revenue volatility like we've talked about. They rely more on more stable sources of revenue. But here's the story in that Governor Gary Locke, who then was a Democrat who went on to serve in President Obama's administration as Secretary of Commerce, worked with the bipartisan group of legislators to enact what they called priority-based budgeting, which is basically trying to figure out the core functions of government. They had a huge budget shortfall, multi-billion dollars, and they said their economy is too weak for a tax increase. And so they came together to find core governing principles and came together to decide between needs and wants on a bipartisan basis. And you know what? At the end of the day, they solved that budget shortfall without a dime of tax increases because they just came together and said, let's prioritize what we're doing. Let's realize that taxpayers have a finite amount of income that we can extract from them without causing too much economic damage. And they came together, Republicans and Democrats alike, and they solved that shortfall without a dime of tax increases. You know what? It's an inspiring story to me that we can get along in a multi-party fashion and do what's right for hardworking taxpayers out there and respecting them by not raising taxes and prioritizing government spending.
Well, that's great to hear. It gives much hope. So basically, the Rich States, Poor States study identifies 15 variables. Can these variables be used as a benchmark, so to speak, of best practices so that when we see states that are operating within principles that in each variable that are positive, there can be expected a positive outcome? Would this be a good toolbook, a guidebook for legislators to use?
We certainly hope so, and that's why we chose these 15 equally weighted factors, in that there are things that matter for future economic growth, future job growth, future wage growth, future population growth. We know that to be the case. In fact, we hired the former vice president of research at the San Francisco Federal Reserve to do a retrospective analysis to see exactly how these 15 ALEC variables in rich states, poor states come together and predict future economic growth. And he found very strong results after doing a regression-based analysis to say these are factors that you can count on to bring about more economic vitality in the years ahead, more economic opportunity. And that's why we're so confident that when policymakers do follow this formula, they're going to see better economic circumstances. Now, does it happen overnight? Of course not. Policy takes a long time to change incentive structures in many cases and change business relocation ideas in many cases. But it's all about being directionally correct, as we say. It's about making that first move. What's the first thing you do to get out of a hole? Is you stop digging. And that's what our message is to so many states that are lacking in economic competitiveness, start making those first steps to become more competitive today, and your taxpayers will thank you for it.
Jonathan, I can't tell you how encouraging that is to hear, to know that there is a way of running government that doesn't have to depend upon a political point of view or ideology, but is data-driven. And your report shows clearly that best practices lead to a better economy. I want to thank you very much for that. In closing, real quickly, can you tell our audience how they can access the full 9th edition of the Rich States, Poor States report?
Well, they can go to ALEC.org, that's ALEC.org, and download the entire Rich States, Poor States report for free, and also check out so many of our other economic policy studies that we have available.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for Skyping in with us today.
It's great to be with you. Keep up the great work in Hawaii.
Thank you. Well, that was Jonathan Williams with the ALEC report, Rich States, Poor States. I encourage you to take a look at it, and we hope that those best practices will be used here in the state of Hawaii and across the United States. Until next week, e hana kako. Let's work together. Aloha.